Well, hello again, Gloucester Christian. Again, it's John Witt, and I'm glad to be back for our third and final video. So Miss Wild told me that you guys were learning about heat and how it's important to keep it out for astronauts. So I wanted to kind of explain a little bit of that to you. But there's really two types of concerns for astronauts as far as heat goes. One, when they're going up to and from space in their spacecraft or their space shuttle. But two, when they're actually living up there on what we call the International Space Station, where our astronauts live with astronauts from other countries. So I wanted to kind of start off with addressing how they keep it nice and comfortable inside the International Space Station where our astronauts live. So check out this video, and then we'll discuss it afterwards.
Not too far from the Hubble is the International Space Station, the only habitat we have that's not on Earth. And because of this, it has a pretty complex thermal control system, but we're only going to concentrate on the basics of the habitable modules. The first step in thermal control is to prevent unnecessary heating. That is, heating that's not caused by operations necessary for the current mission. For most parts, this is solar radiation. In sunlight, the outside of the ISS can reach up to 121 degrees Celsius. So, the station is covered in multi-layer insulation. These insulations are designed not only to reflect heat from the sun, but also to reflect heat back into the station. The goal here is to thermally isolate the interior of the space station from space as much as possible. With the sun out of the way, we can now deal with the heat caused by operations required for the mission. Between the crew, which could be more than 10 at times, and the many computers and scientific instruments, a lot of heat is generated inside the ISS. This heat has to be removed somehow if the station is to maintain a room temperature environment of 22 degrees Celsius. You definitely don't want your astronauts sweating in 0G, and you also don't want them in sweaters either. Generating heat is usually easier than getting rid of it. That's why we have continuous surface operation for over a decade now on Mars, but less than 1 hour on Venus. The heat acquisition system, as it's called, in the habitable modules is a two-loop system. The internal loop is water-based with radiators and cold plates to collect heat from the interior. The heat is then transported to a heat exchanger that's attached to both the internal and external loop. The heat is transferred to the external loop, which uses ammonia as a heat transfer fluid because it's more efficient than water, but also toxic. That's why it's not used in the internal loop. In the external loop, the heat moves from the heat exchanger to these huge radiators, which then radiates it into space. Heat transfer via radiation is the only way to get rid of heat in space, and it's slow, unlike in the movies. That's why large radiators are required for cooling to be effective.
So hopefully you enjoyed that video and it made a little more sense about how our astronauts stay warm in space when they're up at the International Space Station. So I don't know if you caught it, but it goes from negative 250 degrees Fahrenheit to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the temperature range that they're dealing with. And when the sun shines on the space station, it gets up to 250 degrees. That's really hot. So what they were saying is they handle that in two ways. First off, they focus on the outside of the International Space Station, and they put these really thick panels on the outside, and they design it in such a way that those panels basically act like insulation in your house, right? They keep the heat in, right, because they want to keep the heat inside, but they take the sunlight, and when the sun shines on it and it gets up to that 250 degrees, on the outside they coat it with special materials to where it reflects the sun and that heat. So again, they reflect the heat on the outside from the sun, but they keep the heat in that's already inside the house, inside the space station on the inside. But then they have the problem of generating too much heat on the inside, right? Because there's humans naturally give off body heat. There's also computers and a lot of electronics on the space station. So if they just focused on the outside and kept the sunlight from heating it up, that's one thing. But they still have to address what's going on the inside. Otherwise, it would be too much heat from all of those electronics and people there. So it was a little confusing on how they explained it. But basically what they do is they collect the heat where the astronauts are with water. They have the water collect the heat, and then they run the water through pipes all around where they live, and then they use something that they called, it was a very big two words, it was called a heat exchanger. And what they do is they run that water through that heat exchanger and they transfer that heat to another fluid called ammonia. And they mentioned that ammonia was toxic, and that's why they didn't use that fluid on the inside. But that fluid ammonia, once it gets transferred to that, it's running on the outside of the International Space Station. So they don't have to worry about it if it leaks or anything like that, because there's no humans on the outside, so they don't have to worry about that. But then they run that ammonia, that ammonia that's got all that heat in it, into something they call radiation. But basically what it means is they take that ammonia fluid that's got the heat in it, they take it and they basically vent it out to the atmosphere and let it go out to space. So they take all that heat that's building up inside in a nutshell and transfer it through water and ammonia, but ultimately to the outside to vent. So don't get too hung up on all those big words, but the key thing is they use fluid to collect the heat, take it to the outside of the space station, and vent it off to the atmosphere. Now that's how we handle the International Space Station, and that's really important because the astronauts are living there. But there's also the problem of the spacecraft going from the ground, launching up into space, and then coming back home. So you'll see in this next video that I'm going to show you, but again, space can get down to negative 250 degrees, which is the colder than the coldest day we've ever seen, colder than any snowstorm we've seen. But the problem is when it comes back into space, it gets up, when it comes back from space and comes back to Earth and it hits the atmosphere, it can get up to 1,650 degrees Fahrenheit. So they had to take a little bit different approach on the spacecraft in order to get it up to the International Space Station and back down to Earth. So check out this video and let's see how they handle that.
One of the most dangerous times for an astronaut is re-entry to Earth's atmosphere. Most recently, we've watched the shuttle return home and re-enter our atmosphere.
Anytime you have a spacecraft that goes into outer space, one of the major design challenges that you have is how to protect the vehicle when it comes back out of space and re-enters the Earth's atmosphere.
Robbie Kearns manages NASA Langley Research Center's space operations.
So the material that was on the bottom of, say, the Apollo spacecraft actually burned off as the vehicle re-entered the Earth's atmosphere.
This process is known as ablation.
And there was enough on it to protect it throughout the peak heating times, which allowed it to protect the spacecraft until it splashed down in the ocean.
The Apollo spacecraft was designed to be used only once. Today's shuttles are designed to travel to space over and over again for as many as 100 missions. Re-entry is still an issue for the shuttle. The same extreme conditions of space still affect this craft.
So how did the NASA engineers solve the problem this time? They turned to a substance that exists in the most extreme conditions on Earth: sand.
The desert gets incredibly hot during the day, but at night it can get downright frigid. And the sand handles those changes with no problem at all. Those temperature variances are nothing when compared to the tough conditions astronauts face when traveling from the harsh cold of space to the hot friction of re-entering our atmosphere. When the shuttle's in space and passes through Earth's shadow, the temperatures can be as low as minus 157 degrees Celsius. That's minus 250 degrees Fahrenheit. And when the shuttle re-enters Earth's atmosphere, the friction can cause those temperatures to soar as high as 1,650 degrees Celsius. That's 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
When the orbiter re-enters, it re-enters at a very steep angle. As the flow comes up, it wants to come up and then go over. And that turbulence and that velocity of the air that moves over creates a tremendous heat zone.
Back to the sand. So, how does sand fit into this equation?
The tiles really are a unique piece of engineering. They're very lightweight, and what people really don't realize is that they're just sand. They're made of quartz sand, and it's bonded together in such a way that the sand is spaced apart within the structure, and it's very, very lightweight.
That's right. The tiles that cover the shuttle's surface and protect it from extreme temperatures are made mostly of sand. And just think about how many of these tiles are needed to cover the shuttle.
Now, there are about 32,000 different tiles on the orbiters. Each one is specifically designed and sized to fit a specific location.
It's like a giant puzzle. Each piece must fit precisely into the ones beside it. And with the irregular shape of the shuttle, that's no easy equation to figure out.
Now, hopefully, again, that video explained it from how our spacecraft can handle extreme temperatures going up to space and coming back. But I thought it was pretty cool that those tiles that were on the spacecraft or the space shuttle are basically a modified form of sand. And I hope that you got that from it, but what they were trying to explain was that the sand, they basically take a bunch of sand, pack it real tight, and bond it, but make a big square out of that. And those square tiles covered all of it, the entire outside of the space shuttle. And what that does is, just like in the desert when it gets really cold at night, that sand basically absorbs that coldness. But then when it gets hot, it reflects the heat. Well, it does the same thing for the spacecraft. And it keeps the cold out, but it also reflects the heat and prevents it from burning up. And that's why those tiles are also so thick. So hopefully that makes sense and gives you a little more insight into what you're learning about in class. Again, I was so thankful that I got to be with you through video anyway, and explain to you again, what NASA is, my experience at NASA, and then how they insulate their astronauts and protect their astronauts, and keep them at a comfortable temperature, both in the spacecraft and in the space station. So I hope you learned a lot. If you have any questions, feel free to let Miss Wild know. She can get a hold of me, and I'd be more than happy to answer your questions. Well, I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your unit with Miss Wild, but it has been a pleasure getting to speak to you. Have a good day.